Hello, this is Kofi, and I want to walk you through some intermediate skills with using CSS Grid. CSS Grid is a new method for laying out web pages. And here's a design that I'm going to try and lay out using CSS Grid. Okay, so let's get started. All right, so I have some HTML code here. Let me walk you through the structure real quick. I have a header element, and let me pull my design next to it so you can see what this is doing. All right. So I have a header div which corresponds to this top section. I have a div called nav which has a UL for my navigation. I have a div called article which contains all the elements on the left side of the page, everything in this left column. And then I have a div called aside which contains everything in the right column. And then a div with a class footer, which is that gray bar there. All right. So here's what my HTML page currently looks like with no styling. And let's jump into styling. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to call the body element. And then I'm going to give it a width of 940 pixels. All right. I'm going to give it a margin 0, 0 auto. All right, to center it. And then I'm going to be using some fonts. So I'm going to call Verdana, Tahoma as a fallback, and then sans serif as an additional fallback option. So here's what my design looks now. Everything is centered in the page because of the margin 0 auto, which only works when you have a width of 940. Now, quick thing, my grid is actually a 960 grid. I'm only calling 940 because my working area is 940. I had 10 pixels on the extremes that I'm not using, but you can decide to call it 960 if you so prefer. I just used up 940 of my 960. All right, so to lay this out using CSS Grid, we're going to need to call a grid container, a grid parent, to specify what the template looks like, right? And then we'll have to include some children in that parent. So what I'm going to do, since I want to lay this entire web page out with CSS Grid, I'm going to call a div or create a div at the top of my page, and I'll give it a class grid container, and I'll go close that div right before body closes. Okay, oops, sorry, that should say div, and I'll comment it out so I can tell what it is doing. So this closes grid container. Okay, so nothing would have happened to my page at this point because divs do not carry any inherent information. All I've done is to wrap my design up in a parent div called grid container. In my CSS, however, I'm going to call that grid container div, and then I'm going to initialize it by using a property called display, and the value is grid. Okay, now to specify the columns and the widths, I'm going to have to use different properties for that. In my design, I have, broadly speaking, 2 columns. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a property called grid template columns, and columns are specified by using their respective widths, and so you specify the number of columns by giving each column a width. All right, so I'm going to have a column that is 540 pixels for the left side of my design, and then 380 for the right side of my design. So basically what I'm doing is that I'm looking broadly at this section. I did measure it beforehand and it's about 540, and then this section is about 380. And then for the rows, I don't really have a number of rows. I can decide to just leave it like that, or if you're a little bit particular about those things, you may just decide to add a gray template rows and just say auto, because there's really nothing that is going on there. So as you can see, my design is now divided up broadly into 2 columns. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start adding some styling to my header. So I'll call the header div, which is the div that contains my banner image here. So I'll call the header, and then I'll give it a background image. To be more specific, I would say URL. That's how you call a background image. And I'll step out of my CSS folder. So observe my folder structure. I have a CSS folder that I'm currently working in. I need to step into my images, and I'll go into images, and the image I'm trying to call is called header.png. All right, terminates with a semicolon, and then I'm going to give it a height of about 100 pixels, and let's look at what this is doing. Okay, so I have my design there. Now you probably have observed at this point that my header is not spanning across, and the reason why that is happening is because my grid is very strictly now using 2 columns, as you can tell. If you can see how the page is divided up, so my header area doesn't extend and use up the full width of the page. It's only using the 540 because that's how I laid it out. Now I can use CSS Grid to change that. I can decide to make it span 2 columns, all right? And to do that, I'll use a property called grid column start, all right? And grid column start really works this way. You specify the column number that the content should begin at, and then the column number that it should end at. All right, so I'll say grid column starts, it should start at column 1, and then grid column, and I would say it should end at 3. Now, why 3? Because I only have 2 columns. Well, if you wanted to take up 2 columns, you're going to need to tell it to stop at the 3rd column. Even though I technically do not have a 3rd column, I'm going to need to say 1 to 3 for it to span 2 columns. All right. Now, there are simpler methods of writing this. In another video, I would show you how to do those simplifications. But for purposes of instruction, I would just resolve to using the grid column start and grid column end to show you this. All right, so let me refresh this page again, and as you can see, now it spans the entire width. Okay, now there's something really weird going on here. My image is repeating, and I can turn that off by adding a property called background repeat. These things repeat by default when there is more space than the image actually occupies. So I'll just say grid background repeat, no repeat. All right, and that should take care of that, and I'll fill in the rest of that with a background color. Trying to type, and hex code that I'm using is C1272D. All right, so I filled in the rest of it with a color, and you've observed probably that my design has all shifted to the left. The reason is because my nav, if I inspect this again, you can see how my grid template is acting. My nav is now taking up this place, so I need to tell CSS to span my nav across two columns as well. All right, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to call my nav div, which is this div. I'll say .nav, and then I'm going to say grid column start 1, and then grid column end 3, similar to what I had before, but this time for the nav. So you see, so now my nav occupies 2 columns instead of 1. Okay. All right. Let's do a couple of things with the header, and then we'll come back to styling the rest of the design. I'm going to call my logo here and reposition it properly. So I'll say .header img, and then I'll say margin on that 20 pixels and 0, and then 10 pixels and 80 pixels. Now what I'm doing here is that whenever you have 4 values of margin, it goes clockwise. It means the top has a margin of 20 pixels, the right side has a margin of 0, the bottom has a margin of 10, and the left has a margin of 80. So that's basically 20, 0, 10, and 80 is what I've done here. All right, so let's move on. Now let's do some more styling to the nav to try and get it to look like my design here. And here's where things can get very interesting. I'm going to call my nav.nav ul. So I have a ul in my nav. And then I'm going to give it a background color. Okay, I'm giving a background color of I have a hex code written out, already experimented with that. 3F. Yeah, let's refresh our design to see. Okay, now how do I get these things to line up horizontally? Now in a previous method, I could have done that using floats on each li, but since I'm using CSS grid, I can have CSS grid do that for me as well. All right, so you can nest grids. Even though I have a parent that is grid container, I can also initialize my nav as another display grid. So I'm going to do that with my nav ul. I'll say display grid, okay, and I would give it the widths of each li element. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, okay. And what I'm going to do here, I'm going to type it up first, and then I'll explain what I'm doing. So I'm going to use a property called grid template columns, and then I would write in one FR, one FR, one FR, one FR, and then one FR. Okay, and I'm just going to go ahead and add a width on this one as well. 940 pixels is the width. Now let me explain what one FR 5 times is doing. One FR written 5 times means divide up this width into 5 equal portions. Okay, so I have 5 nav items, and I don't know exactly what that translates to if I do the math manually. So I can have CSS calculate that for me by just saying by using fractions. And so one FR means divided up into 5 equal portions, as I have here. 5 different values means it's being divided up into 5. All right, so here's what my design looks like now, as you can see. Okay, now let's edit this a little bit. I can easily simplify this code by using a shorthand. So I'm going to comment this section out. I'm going to use a shorthand for that, because you can tell that that can really get complicated when you have a lot of menu items. I can just say repeat, all right, and 5, 1 fr. Now what this code is doing is that it's doing the same thing as I had above, all right? It is repeating 1 fr 5 times. And so that's a shorthand way of writing that. Okay, so I'm going to save this and refresh, and you can see that I still have the same design. Okay, so let's move on and add some more styling to this. I'm going to go on and start styling the links in there. We'll come back and fix this in a little bit. Let me inspect it and see what's going on there. So I have my UL that extends beyond my grade just a little bit, and it may be a matter of my point size, so I will fix that as we go on. So I'll call nav a to style these links. All right, I'm going to remove the underlines by saying text decoration none. I'll say display block. Display block really expands a clickable area. I want each of these to be clickable. I want the actual area around the text to be clickable as well, not just the text. So that's why I'm using display block on there. All right, and then I'll do a text align center. Okay, and let's try and specify these dividers by doing a border right. So I'll give it a border right of 1 pixel solid, and then the color is white. And let's see what that looks like. So currently this is what I have. You can see that the dividers are all there. And I'm going to give my A some padding because you can tell it's really narrow and I want it to expand a little bit. So I'm going to say padding 10 pixels and 0. What 10 and 0 is doing is that it's going to apply 10 to the top and bottom and 0 to the left and right. So like that, as you can tell. Okay, let's move on. And then the color of my links, I'm going to say color. Or the color property only works as a foreground color, so it only works for text. All right, so I'll say color for that, and as you can see, I've nicely impacted it. All right, and then let's change the font. Oh, actually, I'll just have it use the default fonts that I have up there. Okay. All right, now another thing I want us to do with the main layout is that you notice that there is a gap in my design, all right? But in my preview, you can see that there is no gap here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a property known as grade column gap. I'm going to add that to my grade container. So I'll say grade column gap, and I'll make it 20 pixels. So it's going to add 20 pixels to this side, as you can see. So that's fixed that thing not fitting properly. All right, so I have 20 pixels in here that is added between these two elements. All right, next thing I'm going to do is that I don't know if you can observe there is a little inconsistency here. It doesn't flash correctly, and the reason is because these dividers are being added all the way to the extremes as well, and so I have a border right that is on my last link item, and I don't want that last item to have border right, so I'm going to knock it off by doing dot nav again li, so that's the last item, and I'm going to use a pseudo class called last child. Okay, and then a. So I'm saying that find the last child in my list, which is going to be this one. All right, and call out the link. All right, and then I'm going to say border right in this case is none. So I'm just knocking that off there. You can see that now everything flushes correctly. All right, next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to try and start styling all the elements in my article area. So I'm going to call my article div, which is the div that controls everything in this. So I'm going to call it in here, dot article, and then I will say, actually, let's start off with this image. All right, let's start off with stretching this image to fit. So article img, I'll say width of that image is 100% because I observed that that image doesn't really extend to the edge of the column. As you can probably tell there, you can see that the image doesn't extend all the way to the edge of the column. And so I'm just going to cheat a little bit by stretching it to fit. And that's what I've done there. Okay. And then next, let's move down and start styling the paragraphs. So I'm going to call dot article p, and I'm going to say font size 14 pixels. All right, I'm going to change the point size for that a little bit. It was a little bit too big for my liking. And I'm also going to try and change the font size for this. So you notice that the paragraphs have their font size reduced, but the lists do not, because these are not paragraphs, these are LIs. And so I could easily duplicate this and say dot article li and change the font size that way, but it's really just a repetition that is unnecessary. So instead of doing that, I'll just put a comma here and then say dot article li, okay, and that applies the font size property only once to the two elements, and you can see that all my text is now resized correctly. Okay, we're going to move on to the headlines. This is on H1, this is on H4. Let's start off with the H4. I'm going to say dot article H4, and let's try and do both of them actually. All right, and then dot article H1. All right, and I'm going to say margin on that is 10 pixels and then 0. All right, so what that basically means is I'm going to add a 10 pixel margin to the top and bottom of my headlines and then none to the left and right area. So just to give it a little bit more room, as you can tell. All right, and then we're going to move on. And this wasn't spelled correctly, which is why I didn't affect that. So you can see it now picks it up. So now let's start working on, I have a span tag in my article. All right, I'll try and show you where that span is. It is this section here called read reviews. And so I'm going to style that as well by saying dot article span A. So it goes in order of how they appear in your HTML. All right, so I'm calling the article, which is a parent, span, and then the A, which is a child of the span. So the A is a child of the span, span is a child of article, which is why I declared article span A. All right, and then I'm going to give that a font size of 14 pixels as well. A text decoration of none, and then let's give that a color. Since this is text and it's a link, I'm giving it a color of that value, 7 BB. I actually have 7 characters now. A hex code should have only 6 numbers. All right, so you can see that that styles that section. I'm going to go on and start styling my lists. So I have article UL, and the UL is this. all right here. So I'm going to try and get it to look like my design here, which has lines in between. All right, so article UL, first off, um, I'm going to try and give it, remove any padding that there is. And actually, I don't think I need to do anything with that because there is no padding at all on it. So let's forget about that for a second. Let's go straight to the article UL li. So let's go straight to adding the lines in between the lists. So I'll give it a property called border bottom. I'll say 1 pixels solid, and then the color is black. I can be more specific and just say 4 zeros, which will give me the hex code for black. And you can see that I have the underlines now declared in there. All right, now it is very tight. It looks nothing like my design. Okay, so to remedy that, I'm going to need to adjust the line height. It's another property specifically designed for text. So I'm going to say line height. I'm going to say 220%. Just guessing. And that looks much better. Okay. And then let's go to this, all right, the text right here. You can see in my design, let's see what I have here. So I have an H4, I have an H1 for salad and vegetables, and then I have an H2 for Russian salad, which is this title that I have here. So let's go ahead and start styling these titles a little bit more. Okay, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to use a special pseudo class. So I'm going to do it first and I'll explain what that is doing. I'll say dot article ul plus h4, and then I'll say margin top 20 pixels. And what this is really doing is I'm trying to find a shorthand way of calling all the H4s that appear after, or the H4 that appears after my UL. So if you look at my code, I do have a UL here, all right? And right after that is this H4. Now I could easily come and put a class on it, but I'm trying to keep my code dry. So I'm using a special pseudo class that will target the next element after my UL. So since I know that I can call my UL by doing article UL, I can say find me the next item after the UL, which is my H4. And so that's kind of what this code is doing. And so if I refresh my page, you can see it applies a little bit of a margin to that. All right, next thing I'm going to do is to try and style this. So you can tell, I hope you can see my design, that these are numbered lists. So I'm going to say dot article OL, and let's try and give that a couple of properties. Say list style decimal. All right, that should make it a numbered list. It's by default should have been a numbered list, but what happened was that I am resetting all my browser styles with this reset.css, which can be found in my CSS document. And so it gets rid of all the bullet points and all the numbered lists. And so what I'm trying to do is to restore that using the property list style and the value decimal. All right, so I'm just going to give this a margin right, or sorry, margin left of 20 pixels to try and move it in a little bit. So it's the numbers are outside of my column and I don't really like that. So I'm just moving it in by doing a margin left on there. All right, next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start styling, apply some more styling to my paragraphs, because currently my paragraphs are tight. There is no padding around it, and it's almost touching the image. I think it's actually touching the image. So I'm going to say dot article p, and then I'll say here padding 20 pixels and 0, and that gives it a little bit more room. Okay, and then I'm going to try and apply some styling to this headline as well. So I'll say dot article h1, and then I'll say font size, let's try 25 pixels. Okay, so that looks good. Okay, and then I'll say dot article h2. So my h2 is this title right here, and you can see that is also almost touching that. I'll say font size to first adjust the size, 20 pixels, and then I'll say margin. I'm going to give it a margin 10 pixels to the top and the bottom and 0 to the left and the right, and that looks better. Okay, and then now I'm done with this side. I'm comfortable with how things are looking on the left side of my column, so let's attend to the right side. Okay, now the right side is contained in a div known as aside. Okay, so I'm going to start calling that dot aside, and I'll say padding left. I'll do 80 pixels, and the reason why I'm doing a padding left on it is that in my design there is more space to the left side of this than I currently have previewing. All right, and if I inspect my web page, I know that the space is there. It's just that the content hasn't moved over yet. All right, so I can see that there's a lot of usable space for my aside. So I'm just going to pad it to the left a little bit by calling out the padding left. Okay, and then I'm also going to try and specify this border, this divider here. So I'll say border left, all right, and I'll give it a thickness of 1 pixels. The style is solid and the color is black. All right, or you can just use 3 values if it's the same number repeated, or if you want to be extra specific, just use all that. All right, refresh my page, and now that moves over nicely. Now let's go ahead and start styling some of these lists. So this is contained in a list because, again, one of the principles that I like to use is that things that appear similar in structure and in form, I would style using lists. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is that I'm going to call my aside and my list lis. All right, I'm going to say margin 20 pixels to the top and the bottom of each list item, and then 0 to the left and the right, and that ends up looking something like that. So it adds some space in between each item, which makes it look nicer, more scannable. I'm going to go ahead and add the color to try and style my title. Okay, so I'll say color. That's the hex code is 0097BB. All right, and that styles that text there. These are not affected because these are links, and links you have to style it on the A. So I'm only styling this on the LI, so it's not going to affect the A. So you have to keep that in mind. All right. So let's go ahead and start and add some other properties to this, like a font size property. And I'm going to make this 14 pixels. All right, just to try and reduce that a little bit. And then I'm going to go to the A's the links, so aside A, and then I'm going to try and get rid of the underline, so I'll say text decoration none, and then the color, so this time I can do a color because this is calling out the A's and not the LI, so I can change the color of that by calling it on the A. I'll say color, again, it's that same color that I have up there, okay, and that makes it look like that, okay. And then a few more things. If you notice my design, the images all flush to the right side of the page, and this doesn't do so. Partly because I didn't save the images large enough, but I can cheat a little bit again by stretching it just by a few more pixels in CSS, with CSS, okay? So I'm going to say dot aside img, and I'll say width of each image is 100%. So it means take up 100% of the width that remains in the parent area. So that's kind of what I have there. All right. And then lastly, or last, almost, I think maybe this may be the last, but one thing I do, this footer area, how do you declare it? So I'm going to call out the footer. It's going to be a little bit complex, but we'll get to it in a little bit. So I have a footer div here, as you can see, a div with a class footer. So I'll say dot footer, and then I'll give it a background color of 80 is a gray, and then I'll give it a height so it shows up of 50 pixels, and then I'm going to give it a margin top so it doesn't touch the rest of my content of 100 pixels, and let's see what that looks like. So notice that again we have that same problem that we did with the nav. The footer does not span two columns, and so to fix that, since we've done it already, we only need to call grade grade column stats, okay, and then we'll say it starts from column 1, and then grade column and we'll say 3. So that makes it span 2, so it moves from 1 to 3, and you notice that that now spans it across 2 columns. Okay, now last thing that I want to touch on real quick, I think I may have one more thing to touch on, but anyway, let's do this first. My design, I want a little bit of space between the nav and the content, and as you can see, this is almost touching. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to go back to my nav, my .nav, and I'll say margin bottom. I'll give it about 20 pixels margin. All right, so that just puts a little bit of space between that. So I'm adding a margin to the bottom of my nav, right? So that it doesn't touch my content. So you can see the orange area right there is the margin that was added, and I can extend it if I want to. And then lastly, I think this is the final thing I'm going to talk about, is how do you actually add hover states. So as you can tell, when I mouse over it, there is no indication, no affordances to help me understand that these are actually links. So I'm going to create a hover effect for that, and I'm going to do so by calling my nav anchor tag. So I'll say somewhere around here, I'll say .nav a, and the pseudo class is called hover, okay. And then I would say here background color, all right, 80. And so what that will do is that when I mouse over, it switches to this gray, and that is perfect. All right, so I'll leave it here, and I hope this tutorial helps you. There are many more things that we could do to this design, but basically we've been able to style a web page by laying out the content using CSS Grid. And CSS Grid is really helpful. Again, this code is probably more complex than I would like it to be. So maybe in another video, I will show you how to simplify your code and keep it very dry. I hope you enjoy this. I'll catch you later.